Welcome to the Pitbull Patty Show. This season, we're inviting you to take the Lit Grit Challenge by reading great literature just 1 hour a day, 52 books in 52 weeks to give you the grit you need to succeed. Hey everybody, welcome to the Pitbull Patty Show. I am Patty Stuckler, joined with Connor. My voice is not the best today. I realize I went to a Valentine's shindig event for realtors, and my voice, if I drink too much wine, it just goes.
She was yelling all night.
So I've got to I have to really watch that because my voice I don't know.
So we better do this in one take, in other words.
Yes, yeah, we'll get to it. But this is such a great book. I mean, this was your choice, Connor.
Yeah, and you'll notice it's an author we've already covered. It's Charles Duhigg, and he had the Power of Habit, which is one of my favorite books ever. This book, I think, is phenomenal. I think he's a great writer, the way he interweaves stories throughout the book to really, illustrate his point. Personally, with this book, I thought there were some chapters that I really, really valued more than others, and just in an application of my own life. And what do you think?
Yeah, I thought it was a great book because it kind of tells you about, and it was interesting because we kind of talked briefly about it, but what you
ever so briefly.
Yeah, not very much, but you focus on all the books we've been reading. You focus on different things than I do, so which is interesting. I mean, just the way people, I guess,
Yeah, the things I focus on are really riveting, interesting, and you kind of focus on them minute.
Whatever.
I'm just kidding.
Whatever, but it's like what I thought was really cool was it kind of talked about like how your brain, how you can focus, and if you don't focus on what happens. And so just to get right to it, I felt like some of the most interesting stuff in here was this, and it's full of stories, which is really cool.
Right. It's a page turner. I mean, he really, grabs your interest and keeps your interest and makes you want to read it.
Yeah, and really good. There was one story in here, and in fact, it was so interesting because he's in the chapter he talks about focus. He tells a story about this. I'm gonna look it up here. Air France Flight 447, and that goes into the whole detail of it. It's a great story to read. It's riveting, and it's how this pilot, this Airbus flight, taken off from France, I guess. But the pilot ends up, there's all kinds of problems that happen and crises on the plane and damage to the plane that happens. And so, but the pilot goes into what they call cognitive tunneling, which I'd never heard that term before. Really interesting, I thought, because it's where, and you can...
It's kind of like having tunnel vision.
Yeah, and actually, and not just pilots, but, people who are on their cell phones and they're just hyper-focused on whatever it is they're
like me with my Twitter feed.
Yeah, exactly. You go into a cognitive tunneling apparently with your Twitter feed, and so we all actually do this to some degree, depending on what the task is or that we're doing. But on that flight, the plane was needing to descend instead of ascend, and it got way too high into the thin air, and it ended up with the nose of the plane going straight up, and they went into a stall, which literally the plane fell to the ground in just like a rock. So, and they all died. 228 people, I think there were.
Wasn't it one of the worst plane crashes? And
it was horrible, and the reality of it was that it was so preventable. But when the
alarm bells started dinging.
Yeah, it was on autopilot by the time I believe on that flight. It was a couple hours into the flight or something. But when the mechanical and so it was on autopilot, and then the mechanical problems started happening. Alarm bells were ringing and lights were flashing, and so the pilot and co-pilots were just like, overwhelmed and didn't focus on actually what they needed to focus on, which was, if they would have, that total crash and fatalities all would have been preventable. Then he contrasts that in the book.
It's a really sad story. I know my mom said it was really interesting, but it's really sad.
Well, yeah, it was incredibly sad, but very interesting to me. And then, especially since, my dad was a pilot, Air Force One pilot, or Air Force Two, actually, technically. He was Air Force Two. He flew the vice presidents in the 1970s. But so I know a little bit about planes and flight and so forth from Dad, but he talks about in this book, he compares it to a flight, Qantas Flight 32, which was also a famous flight. And on that flight, ironically,
What's interesting too is that you went on an appointment the other day, and the guy was a helicopter pilot, and he started talking about the Airbus, the France flight, which I thought was really interesting. It's just the law of attraction in action.
well, you're right, and that was actually really interesting. I went on a listing appointment, and the seller is a helicopter pilot, like you said, for the Air Force, based out of Andrews, and we were talking and chatting.
Kobe Bryant.
And I asked him about Kobe Bryant and about, hey, what do you know about that, and kind of what caused that crash and blah blah blah. So he was telling me about that, and then he starts telling me about the flight, this Air France flight that I was just reading at 6:00 in the morning that same day. So here I am meeting with him at like 6 in the evening, 12 hours earlier that very same day. I was literally reading about that flight. And then I read about the Qantas Flight 32, and he hadn't heard about that flight. So I started telling him where that was actually the most damaged aircraft. It was also an Airbus plane, and it was the most damaged aircraft that ever landed safely, where the pilot did everything right. And what happened was, in that, just to give a little brief synopsis of it,
if you've ever seen the movie Flight with Denzel Washington, it's almost like the same story except without the coke and the alcohol.
Okay. All righty then. So just to kind of give you a brief,
it's a really good movie.
Synopsis on it. So the flight was taken off from Singapore, going to Australia, I believe. Anyway, it was a couple minutes into the flight. One of the engines started failing. And then I think it was a couple minutes into the flight. I might be getting those transposed, but one of the engines started failing, and then another engine, out of the 4 engines, another engine started leaking fuel. There was a fire that occurred, and so all these horrible, catastrophic things that you would never want to happen to a plane in flight happened, and the pilot. Then, of course, all the bells started ringing, and all the things started happening. And this pilot was so incredible. So if you ever get a chance to read the full story, and hopefully you'll read it in this book, because it's so great. And, I literally cried. I literally did. I know, I'm such a sap. But I was like, it was so incredible, because the guy, he was so great in how he went from this, oh my God, we're gonna die, right? And, the plane's on fire, and the bells are ringing, and the sounds and everything else. And he goes, and at first he gets into that, kind of oh my God, you can't focus. And then he reverts back to when he first started flying years ago, and what a lot of hobbyist pilots fly are Cessnas. Cessnas are very small aircraft, very basic, simple aircraft.
Right. They're single engine.
Single engine planes. Yeah, my dad had one similar to that years ago when he was young, and the pilot thought to himself, I'm going to revert back to flying this ginormous Airbus as if it was a little tiny Cessna. And by doing that, he focused so incredibly well that he was able to land that plane safely.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible story. And how it ties to the book is he talks about, cognitive tunneling with the plane that crashed, and then with the successful landing of this plane, the Qantas
Flight 32, yeah.
Flight 32. He talks about mental models, and he literally talks about the pilot and how he would drill his co-pilot and their staff, about having mental models, like what to do in the event of X, what to do in the event of Y. So he had kind of played it through his mind, and is this book, do they talk about Michael Phelps, or am I confusing it? But Michael Phelps
might have been in the Habits book.
Well, Michael Phelps, it's the same thing. You create these mental models so that when you run into these problems, you've already faced them in your mind, and you know how to react, and you don't panic. So I thought that was really, really interesting, because the story with Michael Phelps is he was swimming, and then water got in his goggles, which is kind of worst case scenario for a swimmer, and he was able to put that aside, focus, go to his mental models, know that he's practiced for this exact same thing to happen, and able to finish the race. And I think he set a world record.
He did, and it was in the Olympics, and he won a gold medal and set a world record.
So it's really cool. But that's what that story is kind of talking about, is that cognitive tunneling, and then the creating mental models. And that's something that I definitely took away from the book, the mental models. I thought was great.
That was great. I'm glad you brought that up about how they refer to that. I thought the what did you think about the Marine Corps stuff? I thought that was super interesting. If you remember, the Marine Corps was when he was talking about like how you develop self motivation, self drive.
Yeah,
I thought
they
that
talk
was
about
super
the
cool.
inner locus of control versus
Yeah.
the external locus of control. That was another great one. I think that's the first chapter. So you don't have to read far to hear this story.
Yeah, the Marine Corps was interesting because it talks about this guy, and he's kind of like, I don't know what to do with my life, very unfocused about, who he was or where he was going. He ends up going into the Marine Corps, and he really, the Marine Corps had really started a transformation at that time, that they were realizing that their recruits really had no motivation or drive, and they didn't know how to like make decisions. They only knew how to take orders, and what happens is you're out somewhere in God knows what country, and then things happen and you have to make decisions
Right.
in real time for yourself. You don't have a commander telling you what to do. So they talked about like you were talking about, that internal locus where you're really able to make those decisions.
Well, and what the inner versus external locus of control is about is people with the inner locus of control take responsibility for all their successes and their failures, and people with an external locus of control, they blame all the exterior reasons and the environment, and they don't take any responsibility for what ultimately happens, the results that ultimately happen. So it's,
right, they blame events and things like that, like, oh, I can't do something because I'm a woman, or I can't do something because I'm too young or too old or too this or whatever, or something else happened to me.
And what was really interesting to me was they talk about children in school, and if you tell the child that he's smart and that's why he did well on his test, that's an external factor. You can't, intelligence for a lot of people believe it's an innate ability. So it's not a result of their actions or their hard work. But if you tell a student that the reason they did well is because of all the hard work that they put into learning the material and studying and all that, then they develop an inner locus of control. And those students, throughout the years end up doing much better, which I thought was really interesting because you always told me I was really smart. I think she's just bumping my head up. But it's just interesting because it's counterintuitive almost. Like, of course you would want to tell your child, you're smart, you can do it. But what the data says is that you really want to praise the work that they put into it, because that's going to give them the inner locus of control. They're going to be in control of their lives, and they're going to end up being that much more successful, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and in fact, the Marine Corps story where they were talking about how they will take recruits and they'll say, okay, now you go in and you clean up the mess hall. And they give them zero instruction as far as what to do with the leftovers, how to clean it, where the soap is located, how to use the commercial dishwasher, all those things. And then the recruits are looking at each other like, well, what do we do now? So they had to figure things out, and then they overloaded the dishwasher and soap was everywhere and everything was a hot mess. But they got it done. And, hours later, they got it done. And then, one of the commanders, or whatever they're called, would say, found the smallest, weakest looking guy, and then praised him for putting away the ketchup in the right place. The smallest of things. But it just then gave that recruit like, wow, I did something amazing, even though it was something so simple. Yeah. But and it also says like they make a point of not praising people for doing things that come easy. Like say you're a runner and you run really fast and you beat everybody else out. Well, you're already a gifted runner, so that's not hard. So praise people for doing things that are difficult, that are hard, and then that's when they can really develop a lot more self-drive. Is kind of what it goes into. I'm not sure we're explaining it probably as well as
that's why you gotta read the book, guys.
That's why you gotta read the book. That's right.
That's right. One of the things I really liked too was this is probably a theme, but like the chapter on goal setting, and what I loved about it was it talks about the SMART goals, which I'm not going to get into because we've talked about that ad nauseum probably, but they talk about using SMART goals and then what he defines as stretch goals, which are big, ambitious goals, kind of like in finding your major definite purpose, or like the one thing. What does he refer to it as? The I can't remember now, but your one thing. So it was pretty interesting to me incorporating those stretch goals with using the SMART goal model, because it really just gives you a breakdown and a blueprint to how to achieve those goals. I thought that was really, really good. That's something I've taken that model and tried to use that as a blueprint for 2020, and that's how I kind of reverse engineered all the goals, like these stretch goals. And I've kind of stolen that stretch goals thing because now I in my listing presentations I talk about stretch pricing. And
Nice.
that's actually, in retrospect, reading it again, I'm like, oh, that's where I came up with that, which I just thought was pretty
I noticed that when I was reading that. I was thinking he likes that word stretch.
Well, because and when I talk to people about listing their home, I'm like, this is what the comps say, but the market's really strong right now, which it is. But since it's so strong and inventory so tight, why don't we try to stretch the market and list it, another $15,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 higher? And it's actually been working out pretty well so far this year, at least.
But it is interesting. Like this book talks about not just SMART goals and goal setting, things like that. It talks about a lot more broad.
Oh yeah, that's just one chapter.
Yeah, exactly. A lot more broad topics within this book, and kind of how to just think really well, and
I don't know if you read the appendix too. I think it's I don't always read the appendix, but I think for this book it's really worth doing because he takes all of the topics he covers in the book. Well, not all of them, but 4/5 of them or 3/4 of them, and basically gives you practical application for how he even wrote the book.
How to apply the book.
And how, right. And then he gave you examples of how he actually used what he was learning in writing the book, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
Just to give you kind of a practical example.
Yeah, he's great. And I thought that, he talks about teams a little bit, like, and working within a group. And there's a lot of information about some really successful teams like Saturday Night Live.
Yep.
Yeah, that was really super interesting. And I thought about our own team, our own real estate team, like, well, are we a good team? Like, are we? I remember thinking, like, am I doing this? Am I leading this the right way? Am I doing what, are we, am I allowing others to...
That's why I suggested this book.
I mean, like, it talks about, like, letting people all talk, within your team, listening, everybody down to, whoever, Kate, our assistant, whoever it is, that your team members all feel like they have a say-so, that they're listened to, and that it's everybody has psychological safety within the team. So meaning there's no risk to throwing out ideas. They may be the dumbest ideas in the world, but you feel safe to throw them out there. Nobody's just going to make you feel stupid or whatever. That you have to work really hard at just like being a team and getting along, and it was also kind of refreshing when he's talking about the teams that doesn't have to be perfect, and Lord knows we're not perfect. That it could be messy. It can be, I mean, Lord knows we get into arguments and disagreements about lots of things, and some days are really, not the best,
right.
And then other days are absolutely phenomenal, and that's okay, and that's part of a successful team. And it made me feel really good but it also gives you insights if you just want to improve your teams.
Sure.
And how you are or how you work with other people. So there's some really great stories. We'll let you read them.
Yeah. So and I'll be honest, I didn't resonate with those ones as much because I don't have a team beneath me yet. But I
think I have to die first.
Whoa.
Oh, I'm kidding, Connor. Okay, I shouldn't.
It took a dark turn.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, maybe that didn't apply to you as much as it did to me.
Well, it was still all very interesting stuff. Like, I liked reading about the Saturday Night Live and, how they became so successful and everything that went into that. I just, some of the other things, just where I am in my life right now, I'm trying to really, get ahead and, just bought a new house and trying to, going to get married later this year. So I'm really trying to build the foundation for, having kids and all that. So, different chapters kind of resonated with me than some of those.
And that's true. Anybody reading this book is going to, depending on where you are in your life, is going to take different things out of it. And, just to kind of wrap things up, I feel like I know how hard it is to read every day. And I have really gotten into, thankfully, some really good habits now of
Lord
reading
knows
every day.
It's been hard recently.
It's really hard right now. We are both moving. You're moving. I'm moving.
I'm totally renovating a house.
This is a new setup.
And
people probably don't even realize because it looks so similar.
Right.
You may not realize, but we're actually in a different location. It's a secret location. But this is a totally different location. And, so it's crazy right now. And so I think to myself, oh my God, I don't have time to read today. I have way too much to do, too much going on, but I still carve out the time. And then it's when a moment happens like the other day that we've already talked about, like then you're telling a story. You heard that story that they're telling you, and you can then tell them a new story they hadn't heard. And you just, it may not seem like some of this information sometimes is like, well, how's that really going to help me? Just to read and go beyond yourself and see what all is out there and hear the stories, and a lot of the information that's self-help and self-development is so wonderful. But even just hearing stories about, some of all these kinds of stories, whatever they are, they help your mind grow in ways that you really can't even anticipate. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, it just kind of, it's your brain gets into kind of muscle memory. You get kind of used to the same thought pattern, so it just kind of forces you to get outside of that. Yeah,
forces you to grow.
So it's really
so
good.
That's why reading. That's why I'm not doing this to drive myself crazy or to drive you crazy, Connor. I don't get paid for this. I don't.
Debatable.
I don't do this to sell houses. That's not what this is about. This is truly a love of reading and a belief that we can all empower ourselves by reading really great nonfiction books. And my true goal is, if more people read, then the happier people will be. And I think that'd be, what a wonderful world that is, if people are really happy and love themselves and they're in a better place to love others. And just have a better
understanding of themselves and the people around them. It really kind of gives context to why some people behave the way they do. And instead of what is that saying? I'm going to butcher it, but it's, don't attribute malice where stupidity will do. So a lot of times we're quick to judge other people's intentions, but a lot of times they don't even realize, what they're doing, the effect it's having, or the consequence it has.
Yeah.
So I think it's really good, and so that's why we're doing it, because Lord knows I am not a reader.
Yeah, and I know sometimes you're like, oh my God, Mom, why did you get me involved in this?
I'm always looking for guests. If you want to be a guest on the Pitbull Patty Show and
take your place,
read for a week and take my place,
well,
I encourage it.
Okay, well, to wrap it up, in fact, this is the book, so this will be easy week for you, okay? It'll be an easy read for me, and I've read this before, but this is a great book. This is called Real Estate Investing by Eric Tyson and Robert Griswold. The reason I wanted to do this one, and this will give you a little bit of a break. I know you've had such a tough schedule like me, but this book, so many people ask all the time about real estate investing.
Absolutely.
So I just thought, hey, if and part of happiness is doing well financially. You don't have to be a
it certainly
gazillionaire.
Makes things easier.
Makes life easier if you have a little bit of money. So if you would like to get into real estate investing and want some basic questions, this is not a deep book. This gives basic information that's really helpful, and I think will answer a lot of questions for people that are just starting out. This is not for an advanced investor.
Right.
This is somebody who's thinking about it.
Give you a foundation.
Yeah, exactly. So read this. And by the way, if you we do the video podcast, just FYI, because so many people are on Facebook, especially my age.
Sure.
Your age, not as much, but they're on Instagram and all over. But if you like podcasts, that's where I started with this podcast with just an MP3. You can find us, the Pitbull Patty Show, in iTunes. You just go on iTunes and you can type that in. If you type in Pitbull Patty, it'll pop right up, and all the episodes, including the past 3 seasons, are on there. If you want to just listen to audio, like in your car or working out and running and whatever. You can listen to it just by MP3. So check that out. And just let us know what your thoughts are. If you want to, certain books that you want covered that you think would fit what we're doing here with the Lit Grit Challenge, just let us know. Yeah. Have a great week. Happy reading.